The Whispering Pines. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, nestled among ancient forests, lay the small town of Millbrook. For generations, locals whispered about the eerie phenomena surrounding the old Whispering Pines Sanatorium, abandoned since the 1950s. Ethan Hayes, a skeptical paranormal investigator, arrived in Millbrook on a crisp autumn evening. The townsfolk eyed him warily as he checked into the only motel in town. That night, Ethan tossed and turned, plagued by vivid nightmares of emaciated patients reaching out to him from behind rusted bars. The next morning, Ethan hiked up to the decrepit sanatorium. As he approached, an unnatural silence fell over the forest. The building loomed before him, its windows like hollow eyes staring into his soul. Ethan shuddered but pressed on, determined to debunk the local legends. Inside, the air was thick with decay and something else, a metallic tang that coated his tongue. Ethan's flashlight beam danced across peeling wallpaper and overturned gurneys. In what once was the main ward, rows of iron bed frames stood like sentinels. As Ethan set up his equipment, a faint whisper caught his attention. He froze, straining to listen. There it was again, a barely audible murmur, as if carried on a non-existent breeze. The words were indistinct, but the desperation in the voice was unmistakable. Suddenly, Ethan's EMF meter shrieked to life, its needle swinging wildly. The temperature plummeted, his breath visible in the beam of his flashlight. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of pleading voices surrounding him. Ethan stumbled backward, his heart pounding. As he turned to flee, he saw them. Gaunt figures in tattered hospital gowns, their eyes sunken and desperate. They reached for him with skeletal hands, their mouths moving in silent screams. He ran, the voices pursuing him through the maze-like corridors. Ethan burst out of the sanatorium, not stopping until he reached his car. As he sped away, he glanced in his rearview mirror. For a moment, he saw a crowd of spectral patients standing at the edge of the forest, watching him leave. Back in his motel room, Ethan's hands shook as he reviewed his footage. To his horror, he found nothing but static. His audio recordings were silent, and his photos showed only empty rooms. But as he zoomed in on one image of the main ward, his blood ran cold. There, barely visible in the grainy picture, was a skeletal hand reaching toward the camera. Ethan left Millbrook the next day, his skepticism shattered. But the whispers followed him, haunting his dreams. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, he could swear he heard them calling his name, begging him to return to the Whispering Pines. The Forgotten Frequency. In the summer of 2023, radio enthusiast Mike Carpenter stumbled upon a mysterious frequency while tinkering with his ham radio in his Chicago apartment. The signal was weak, barely audible through the static, but what he heard chilled him to the bone. A woman's voice, distorted and desperate, repeated the same phrase, "Please, anyone. They're coming. The stars are wrong. Help us." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by an otherworldly hum that made Mike's teeth ache. Intrigued and unsettled, Mike spent weeks trying to trace the signal's origin. His research led him to a small town in rural Nevada, where a secret government facility had supposedly been abandoned in the 1970s after a series of unexplained incidents. Unable to shake his obsession, Mike took a leave of absence from work and drove cross-country to Nevada. The closer he got to the coordinates he'd calculated, the more his radio picked up bursts of that eerie transmission. The facility was hidden in a desolate valley, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with razor wire. Warning signs dotted the perimeter, their paint faded by years of harsh desert sun. Mike's radio crackled to life as he approached, the woman's plea now crystal clear. Heart pounding, Mike found a gap in the fence and slipped inside. The main building was a concrete monstrosity, its windows dark and empty. As he entered, his flashlight beam revealed dust-covered equipment and hastily abandoned workstations. In the central control room, Mike found a bank of radio equipment surprisingly well preserved. His hands trembled as he powered it on, and suddenly the room was filled with that familiar hum. The woman's voice came through the speakers, but this time, she wasn't alone. Other voices joined hers, a chorus of terror and desperation. As Mike frantically adjusted dials, trying to communicate, the voices grew louder. They spoke of experiments gone wrong, of doorways opened that should have remained closed, of creatures that defied description. And they begged for help, for someone to reverse what had been done. Suddenly, the radio erupted in a deafening screech. Mike stumbled back, covering his ears. When he looked up, he saw something impossible. The air in front of the radio console was rippling, like heat waves on asphalt. But it was ice cold. The ripples grew, spreading outward. Through them, Mike caught glimpses of another place, a twisted landscape of impossible geometry under a sky filled with unfamiliar stars. And moving through that alien world were things, shapes that hurt his mind to look at directly. Panicking, Mike ran. Behind him, he heard an unearthly howl and the sound of something large moving through the rippling air. He didn't stop until he reached his car, peeling out of the valley with tires squealing. Miles down the road, his radio suddenly came to life. The woman's voice, clearer than ever, spoke directly to him. "You shouldn't have come. Now they know. They'll follow the signal. God help us all." The radio died, leaving Mike in terrified silence. In his rearview mirror, storm clouds gathered over the facility, flashing with strange lights. As he sped towards the nearest town, Mike realized with growing horror that his radio wasn't the only one picking up the signal now. Every station was filling with those desperate pleas and warnings. And in the distance, beyond the gathering storm, the stars began to shift. The Bone Carver's legacy. In the heart of New Orleans' French Quarter, tucked away in a forgotten alley, stood the curio shop Memento Mori. Its proprietor, elderly Madame Laveau, was said to be a descendant of the infamous voodoo queen. Jess Morrow, a struggling artist, stumbled upon the shop one muggy evening. The window display caught her eye. Intricate sculptures carved from what looked like ivory, each depicting scenes of eerie beauty. Intrigued, Jess entered. Inside, the air was thick with incense. Madame Laveau emerged from the shadows, her dark eyes gleaming. "You have the touch," she said, grasping Jess's hand. "The bones call to you." Before Jess could respond, Madame Laveau pressed a small, ornate knife into her palm. "A gift," she whispered. "From bone to bone, the stories will flow." That night, Jess dreamed of skeletal fingers guiding her hands, carving impossible shapes from gleaming ivory. She awoke to find her fingers stained with an oily residue, the knife on her nightstand. Drawn by an irresistible urge, Jess began to carve. Her creations were beautiful and terrifying, cityscapes that seemed to shift when you looked away, faces contorted in ecstasy and agony. Galleries clamored for her work, and soon Jess was the talk of the art world. But with each sculpture, Jess felt herself changing. Her skin grew pale, her body gaunt. She was ravenous, but nothing satisfied her hunger. And always, there was the whispering in her mind, urging her to create more, to carve deeper truths from the bone. As her fame grew, so did the whispers about the source of her medium. Art critics noted the uncanny realism of the bones she used, how they seemed to pulse with an inner life. One night, exhausted and half delirious, Jess followed the whispers to an old cemetery. There, beneath the light of a bloated moon, she found herself among open graves. With trembling hands, she reached for a weathered femur. The moment she touched it, visions flooded her mind. She saw the life of the bone's owner, their joys, their sorrows, their deepest secrets. And she knew that in carving their bones, she would tell their stories. Jess worked feverishly, her studio filling with sculptures that seemed to breathe and move in the corner of your eye. But as she carved, she felt her own life force draining away, feeding the creations. At her grand exhibition, the crowd gasped in awe and horror. Each piece seemed alive, telling silent tales of lives long past. But when they turned to congratulate the artist, Jess was nowhere to be found. In her studio, the police found only a final sculpture, a skeletal figure hunched over a workbench, knife in hand. The sculpture was so lifelike, one officer swore he saw it move. Madame Laveau closed her shop that night, smiling to herself. The bone carver's legacy would live on, as it had for generations. In the back room, a new knife waited, ready for the next artist with the touch. And in galleries across the world, Jess's sculptures stood silent sentinel, waiting for the right viewer to hear their whispered stories, to feel the pull of bone calling to bone.